Alfred Wegener argued that all the continents were once part of a single supercontinent, which he called Urkontinent. And that's German for primal continent. That supercontinent is now known by its Greek equivalent, Pangaea, and virtually all scientists believe it really existed. But the scientific community thought Wegener was nuts when he proposed it. What made him so sure he was right? That's what's up next on PS100. The most obvious bit of evidence was the fact that the continents look a bit like scattered jigsaw pieces. As you can see, it doesn't take much work to fit them together. Wegener wasn't the first to notice this, but he took it more seriously than his contemporaries, and he noticed the puzzle pieces seemed to fit together in 4 other ways. First, continental structures seem to match up, like continental shields, which are the roots of ancient mountains that have eroded long ago. See how these shield areas in South America line up with shield areas in Africa? Existing mountain belts line up as well, like the Appalachian Mountains, which extend right up into what are now the British Isles and Scandinavia. Even the sedimentary rocks that make up each continent's stable platform line up. Then, there's the fossil evidence. Wegener discovered that the same sorts of plants and animals lived in regions that were later split apart. There's no way these plants or animals could have crossed the ocean, and the regions we find their remains in line up too well to be coincidence. He also found evidence of climatic regions that line up. It seems glaciation occurred in these regions, and that doesn't make sense unless the continents used to be arranged differently. I mean, why was eastern South America cold enough to support glaciers, but the much higher and colder Andes Mountains weren't? Or how could glaciers form on India so close to the equator? And if it was colder at the equator back then, why did glaciers form down here and not up in the higher, colder Himalayas where we see them today? But, like I said, almost no one believed Wegener. They felt that he had sort of cherry-picked evidence that supported his theory and ignored evidence against it. But then, around 20 years after Wegener died, scientists began studying the magnetic patterns created in certain rocks by Earth's magnetic field. As it turns out, some lava contains a naturally magnetic mineral called magnetite. While the lava is still molten, grains of magnetite act like needles on a compass and line up with Earth's magnetic poles. Then, when the rock cools, the position of those needles get locked into place. When scientists began studying these magnetic patterns, they discovered something funny. They didn't all point north, unless you put the continents together like Wegener said they used to be. This evidence was hard for most to ignore, and the tide began to turn in Wegener's favor, but no one was sure how the continents managed to travel so far from home. Then, during and after World War II, navies around the world started playing hide-and-go-seek in submarines. They all wanted to find the best places to hide. So they started mapping out what the ocean floor looked like, and discovered both the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and a number of deep trenches running close to the continents. When scientists began to study the ocean floor, they found that the oldest rock samples they collected there were only 200 million years old. That's nothing compared to the rocks we find on the continents, which can be more than 4 billion years old. More samples throughout the ocean show that rocks on the seafloor get increasingly old as they approach the continents, and this, along with other evidence, leads to our seafloor spreading theory in 1960. According to this theory, the soft and partially molten upper mantle is rising near the mid-ocean ridges. Out of this rising mantle material, a little bit of liquid basalt is produced that rises even further, all the way to the surface where it hardens into brand new oceanic crust. A crust that is hard and brittle. From there, the new crust slides horizontally away from the ridge over the softer mantle layer below like a conveyor belt. As the oceanic plate moves away from the mid-ocean ridge, it ages and gets colder and denser until it finally sinks back down into the mantle at a trench, where it is melted and recycled. Ultimately, as more research accumulated, the idea that the continents were drifting on a spreading seafloor culminated into what we now call the theory of plate tectonics. This theory is pretty much universally accepted today, which means Wegener is getting some sweet, sweet posthumous vindication. That's it for this episode. For more science and research opportunities for BYU undergrads, be sure to check out the links in the description below.